Okay, so people are entering the panel discussion now. So I want to welcome everyone. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff. I'm the chair of the Curatorial Practice program at the School of Visual Arts. And I convened this panel today, and I wanted to begin to just say a few things before our guests speak and talk about the structure. So first, the structure is I'm going to make this introduction. Each of our panelists will have just short of 10 minutes to discuss their thoughts relating to the subject of the politics of friendship. We'll have a conversation for a few minutes, and then we'll open it to your comments and questions. So let me begin by just framing this by talking about why this discussion today. And obviously, we're living in a time of a pandemic that's forced us all apart, that's forced us into distance and isolation at the same time that because of technology, we've come to what I'll call remote nearness, a strange form of intimacy that we're all experiencing right now on Zoom. And in the time of the pandemic, the kind of pressures, societal pressures that have framed and inflamed racial and economic inequities and yet have brought us to crucial historical movements like Black Lives Matter and those around gender and indigenous populations, just as at the same time we have toxic authoritarians like Trump that have, on the other hand, created enlivened urgencies around democracy. So that's why I wanted to bring this panel together to talk about friendship, personal and political notions of affiliation, about what these things mean now and what they can mean in the days ahead. Of course, as you all know, these are old subjects, back to Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he writes 2 chapters about friendship. And there have been many, many discussions by philosophers, sociologists, theorists over the centuries. But I think, based upon what I've said about the pandemic, about the kinds of inequities that we're seeing now, this feels like an urgent moment for this conversation. So I'm grateful to Céline, Kristina, and Shuddha for joining me in this talk. And I'd like to frame the discussion with 2 quotations and then some terms and phrases. So one phrase that has meant a lot to me is from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, in which he has this phrase, which in English is to be with oneself in the other. That's the way that he defines friendship. So in that phrase, you can see that there's this sense of intimacy, of fusion, of melding with another person, with an other. And yet at the same time, of course, we are still ourselves, so that there is always that sense of tension, of division, at the same time that there's this sense of being with the other. And the phrase, of course, which comes from philosophy, being with. What does being with mean? The other quotation is from Céline, one of the speakers today, from her book, The Company She Keeps. Friendship-like support is considered here as an essentially political relationship, one of allegiance and responsibility. So even in that notion that I just discussed with Hegel, of that sense that there's always the sense of being with the other in friendship, but also the divide. That divide in itself, that as Aristotle said, consenting, that with senses, that is part of friendship, the consensual, is that notion that there is the divide that is the political, that sets up the conditions of the political. So here are some terms that I thought of around in the spirit of friendship, and you can see how they play out, that they're terms that relate to the psychological, of affect, of emotion, but also of organization, of ideas of the way couples and others come together.
Oh, couples.
So whoever is not muted, can you please mute? So there are these ideas of self and other, of like to like, of similarity, of relationship, of these kinds of friendship. For example, Sybil Schwarzenbach has written a book around this idea of what she calls civic friendship, and introducing women, including women in the state. So there are these notions that we must address around gender and class. And that brings me to the other side, the shadow of friendship, to what I say here as rupture and imbalance, sameness, similarity, relation as oppression, difference as oppression, nationalism, racial inequity, gender, economic and class inequities, religious wars and tribalism, jealousy, betrayal, enmity, enemy. And of course, many of you probably know Carl Schmitt, the political philosopher who was crucial to fascism, wrote specifically saying that the political as a concept is based upon what he called the relationship of friend and enemy. So these are the kinds of terms that I think will come up in the conversation, and that we think about when we think about friendship and affiliation, association, alliance. And with that, I wanted to simply welcome again our guests today. We've put up these very brief bios for you to look at about each of them. There are many people, of course, who think about this, but I was thrilled that Céline, Shuddha, and Kristina agreed to come because their work has so specifically, in ways, addressed these notions of relation, with Céline being the author, editor of a very important book to me, Support Structures, and then more recently, her book, The Company She Keeps, in which she speaks to various people about the idea of friendship. And Shuddha, who's as part of Raqs Media Collective, have thought about these issues in many creative ways. And then Kristina, who is the head of, to me, one of the most outstanding organizations, certainly in New York, that thinks about institutional and the idea of community in terms of the notions of friendship. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Céline.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Stephen, for this very generous introduction. It's nice to be invited to talk about this anew, I think, and in my case also to revisit some of the thinking and references that I've been using for some time. I just wanted to mention, I saw some people joining in the shape of really friendly faces, including the very friendly face of Vasif Korsun, that I wouldn't hereby embarrass by saying, somebody I'm deeply indebted to, because the whole project on support would have not happened without him, and without the residency that I had at Platform many, many years ago. So somehow interests converge in a way that I think friendship is not unrelated to. I have just a few images that I'd like to somehow anchor what I'm going to say to. So I'm going to share my screen to these 4 images. Let's see if this works. Okay, whoops. Let's see. I don't know if I can do a full screen. There you go. Does that work for everybody? No. Okay, so I can't do a full screen. Let me see. Desktop, maybe. No, that works. Okay, does that work now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to start with a disclaimer, actually, my disclaimer, because, you know, why talk about and why work on a subject like friendship today? You know, I mean, Stephen, you've mentioned a renewed urgency on it, but in my case, it is something that I've given quite a lot of work and attention to for quite a long time. And I just wanted to mention or remind myself and remind others that you know, my entry into this subject, and I think a really, really valuable entry into this subject is, you know, very simply from a very selfish point of view, the search, the need for a set of terms, a vocabulary to define, to outline, and in some ways also invent desirable conditions. And what I mean by that is the process of finding acceptable ways to live and work, for inventing, creating, and therefore demanding conditions for living and working that are, you know, a way of being in the world, a way of being active in the world and contributing to the world, that are difficult to ask for, really difficult to understand, and incredibly important in the really long-term process of a practice or a project. So friendship and support for me are part of that, you know, like really trying to find a set of terms that I could almost start working from, like a basis, right? So those books that you mentioned, both Support Structures and The Company She Keeps, are things that allow me to start, right? They're really like position finding. The other thing I wanted to say about this is that this, you know, like proposal of these terms, you know, support and friendship, inherently perceived as positive or constructive and somehow a little bit romantic, are also a way of, in my particular case, trying to propose something beyond a simple critique, meaning that the identification of the negative, and by which I mean what you don't want, how you don't want to work, right? The people you don't want to work with, very much the conditions you do not want, are a way of doing critical work. But another way of critical work that for me was more suitable, more important, was a way of proposing otherwise. As Avery Gordon says, so, you know, Avery, somebody very important to me, who is, of course, in the book, The Company She Keeps, she says that we have elaborate languages for what we don't want, but we're always missing a rich language for what we do want. The political vocabulary of what we want, justice, peace, equality, freedom, happiness, is often too abstract or too embarrassing to intelligent people who, for reasons we don't have time to get into and evaluate, seem always to find them too simplistic or contaminated, or a word that often comes up is too naive, right? Of course, what we want is not just a language, but a whole way of being, a way of life. To live in the shadow of the bottom line is to make a crucial perceptual and behavioral leap, to live as if you were free to determine the terms of living. Or another way of saying this is a sentence that I keep coming back to by John Berger, who says something along the lines of, there are always new horrors, but happiness is always the same old one, right? I mean, I think that's a serious problem, right? The lack of a positive vocabulary to go forward with it. And that is the point for me. That's the point of working on issues like friendship, like support. It's not a demand towards the future as a way of articulating a position and a practice as well. Now, the next question that comes up from that is, okay, so how, you know, what do you do with this? And that's why I wanted to show a couple of images. These are all, actually, I mean, there's only 4 images. Huh? There are spreads from a book that I made called Bao Bao, which is kind of a monograph, but a book that was entirely developed with graphic designer James Langdon, who is somebody that I've collaborated with for a very long time, and also one of the founding directors of East Side Projects. Now, the premise that I just announced somehow, you know, what I think this articulates is an idea of alliance as a basis for working in culture, because that's the territory that I work in, right? That's the sort of site that I work in, because I'm an artist. I work in what is by by and large, a really polluted and contaminated space, right? The extractivist history of the museums is one of the contexts that I enter, even before I've done anything. We've got a really rich history of what's wrong with museums, what is wrong with white cubes and their exclusionary natures. And this is the context in which I work and in which I have chosen to work. So in that sense, friendship is not a romantic idea at all. It's not a pursuit of a sort of, it's not rose tinted, but it's literally a way of working and surviving within this extremely exclusionary realities that we deal with every day. So, I don't need to remind anyone, you're all very familiar with the fact, the problems associated with the fact that the very foundations of Western notions of culture or socialities or ways of being together are exclusionary, are extremely exclusive. And of course, so in the history of friendship, especially as it appears in philosophical discourse, women and slaves are outside this history. They're outside the history of culture, they're outside the history of art, and they're also outside the history of friendship because they were not considered equal, right? So that need of equality, equal, in parentheses, in a world like ancient Greece in which only men, free men, so men who are not enslaved, are considered equal. So of course, this is based on an idea of equality that is completely outdated. Nevertheless, this is something that we have inherited. And that means that the way that friendship appears in philosophy is often as an abstract notion, whereas, as we know very well, both women and slaves, the others, provide a really rich archive that shows completely otherwise, right? There, of course, friendship appears in it. And for that reason, I both desire and in a way demand the ways of thinking about friendship that start from the practical activities of the excluded. Now, what does that mean in a context like the museum? It means, for example, in a very pragmatic way, how so much of the labor inside culture and cultural work, of course, is both invisible and considered non-essential. Like, for example, the very making of the museum, who made the floor and who made the walls. So that material, the hidden labor of the museum, for me, provides the first material that I work with, right? The raw material. In French, you would say matière première, the very first thing that you start working with. So who makes the stuff, like what is considered work and what is not considered work? So when you walk into an exhibition, of course, there are all these layers of hierarchy of what is visible and invisible, what is considered and unconsidered, which is, and very much artworks appear at the cost of other things, right? A certain level of things are deleted by this. Both those practices and objects are, in a way, what I'm trying to work with. So this is, the most direct way that I can explain how befriending, in my case or in my practice, becomes like an operational, like a practical set of not just preoccupations, but a way of doing things. And this brings me to the idea of elective affinities that, of course, friendship is considered part of. Elective affinities based on the idea of kinship, a kinship that should not, and this is a way of, again, rejecting the idea of sisterhood or brotherhood that are so exclusionary. Elective affinities and kinship in terms of who you want to stand with. Which issues become essential to going forwards. And these kinds of forms that ultimately, are the politics behind the work. And for me, also very much the politics that make the work possible in the first place. So this is my little presentation. I hope I kept in time. And of course, I'll be available afterwards for questions.
Thank you, Céline. Shuddha.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Céline, for setting the tone so well. I'm, as Stephen mentioned, part of a triangulation called the Raqs Media Collective, and we're three people who have successfully who've succeeded in not being enemies for the last 30 years. So we've been friends. We began as friends. We were together in film school, and then we began working together. And I think that the experience of working in a collective like ours produces new challenges for the question of what precisely those elective affinities are, because that Céline referred to, because in our case, we have to elect to be affines of each other on a daily basis, and have been doing so for 30 years. So that's a challenge, because familiarity can also bring contempt, and how do you transcend contempt to try and discover new things in yourselves and in the other person? How effectively do friends stay strangers? And that is actually the core of what I'm trying to think about, because I think the foundation of friendship is actually begins from a ground of estrangement. The difference between brotherhood and friendship is that you don't choose your brothers. Your brothers are chosen for you by your lineage, whereas friends are precisely those who are not brothers or not sisters. Friends are those you choose. And that ground of choice has to begin with some kind of recognition that the person who is a stranger, who could potentially be your enemy, is actually someone whom you share something with. Because until the time they become your friend, you don't know whether they're going to be your enemy or not. And I think that's a very fascinating ground of ambiguity and uncertainty, where I think the aesthetic has a role to play. And I'll come to that in a minute. But the only thing I wanted to show was this cup, which was the centerpiece of a work that we made, which was a film, an installation, a set of conversations, a set of encounters. And on the cup, you find written in Greek the word pamphilos, which means the friend of all. And this cup is a facsimile of a cup that was found in a shipwreck, which is called the Antikythera shipwreck, which is more than 2,000 years old in the Mediterranean Sea, where there is this drinking cup with the word pamphilos written on it. And there's speculation about the fact, was pamphilos an attitude? Was pamphilos actually a person? I have seen in Greek museums tombstones with the word pamphilos written on it, which is to say, you know, this person who died was the friend of all. So what does it mean to be the friend of all? We take our understanding of what this means from a friend of ours, the late Svetlana Boym, who was a professor of Slavonic languages and literatures in Harvard, and also an artist and writer. And she wrote copiously on what she called the luminosity of friendship. And she particularly meant intergenerational female friendships, friendships between women of different ages, which didn't necessarily have to depend on alliance building, mutuality, or reciprocity. In fact, these were what she used to call laughingly useless friendships. They had no utility. And that, in fact, was their greatest freedom. We came to her, or she came to us, through a reading of what she called the off-modern sensibility. She having grown up in the Soviet Union, we having grown up in India, both our experiences seemed to be tangential to the narrative of 20th century sort of heroic modernity. And that being at that tangent, being sort of outside, inside, being in the vestibule between the grand narratives, we found a certain kind of resonance with each other, which is not reciprocity. It was a mode of recognition of each other's familiar strangeness. And that, I think, is one of the really interesting things about the relationship between friendship and the aesthetic experience, is that encountering an idea, encountering an image, encountering a concept can give rise to an almost intravenous interstitial experience between people who are strangers. Whether you are jamming as musicians, whether you're working together as dancers, whether you are contemplating an image in a museum, strangers can feel an almost somatic connect between themselves if they are in the same place, or between their sensibilities, even if they're separated in time. I often think that some of my best friends died 600 years ago, but they remain my best friends. And that sense of being in some form of resonance, and I think resonance is the word that I'm really looking for. It's not reciprocity, it's not mutuality, it's not being of aid to each other, but of being in some ways struck by the same frequencies, if you like, which creates a kind of condition of friendship. Before I end, I just want to point to a work that we made actually as a response to a provocation by Stephen for an exhibition that he curated called Hosts and Guests in the Tel Aviv Museum of Modern Art, where we actually created a body of work which looked at the uncanny friendship between the literary corpuses of two people who would be considered normatively enemies, the poet Yehuda Amichai, who wrote in Hebrew, and the poet Mahmoud Darwish, who wrote in Arabic. And these two great poets had a kind of secret friendship, which I think is only possible by people who are condemned as traitors by other people. Their treason was a loyalty to each other that transcended the sort of watertight compartments of national affiliation and loyalty. I'll end with that because I think that art allows us to be honorable traitors.
Thank you, Shuddha. Kristina.
Well, first of all, it's completely unfair to have me go after Céline and Shuddha. So, because how do I follow that? How do I follow that? Both of you, I'm quite inspired by your remarks this morning, and thank you, Stephen, for inviting me to join this conversation. You know, when I spoke with Stephen earlier in the week, and just from his emails, this has offered me an opportunity to think about now having, you know, the great privilege of running BRIC as an institution. What does it mean for an organization to think about our work from a place of authenticity and true connectivity and meaning? And those are things that resonate with me when I think about friendship. And you know, nonprofit organizations today have been actually just, I think we've lost our way almost completely, where we've deprioritized the very thing that we say we're about, arts and cultural practice. I'm speaking of the arts and cultural nonprofit world, and overly prioritized kind of maximization, power and growth. More kind of industrial sensibilities. We have become very hierarchical and linear, leaving less space for failure and the unknown, you know, and in an art space that has become the norm is extremely troubling to me. And I think because BRIC has had over 40 years of working really deeply in community, I've been inspired 2 years into my role there to really lean into that. And what does that mean, right? We've because we are also the public access center for the borough of Brooklyn, we are mandated to ensure that free speech, freedom of speech, whether we agree or not, is a core part of how we work. And so this pandemic that has thrown us all kind of upside down has been a moment for BRIC to really go back to our root cause and live our values and do work that has made us kind of remove some of these blinders that we had on and truly excavate the things that we were doing wrong and go back to being friends with the people who matter most and let them know it and have them have some of this power. How do we create more spaces for equity, voices to be at the table, for people to have these meaningful connections with us as an organization? And so I've been rolling out with BRIC based on this human-centered strategic plan that we did when I got hired a year ago. It was informed by all the folks that we serve and is very much action-oriented and responsive to them. So, you know, we've been making sure that every step of the way that we are moving away from this hierarchy and moving towards one that's more of a collective wisdom, that calls us to action in ways that are reflecting our values that we say we're about, but also allows us to be held accountable. And that's part of when I think of friendship, the ability for somebody to say to you in your community that you care about, you're doing it wrong, right? Like, you need to redo that. You need to revisit that. You're not doing it right, or you're not listening, or, you know, to have generative conflict. And so how can an organization be like that? And BRIC is going through that process. It's a culture change moment for us. I'm new to this community of Brooklyn. I'm not from this country. And for me too, navigating some of these spaces that are not commonplace to me, just in terms of the American psychology, even though I can code switch, there is some of that vulnerability that has made it possible for me to create deeper bonds, create spaces for more meaning, for us to be more authentic, for us to be uncomfortable together, for us to know that there is another way, and to be okay with challenging these stereotypical notions, you know, these hierarchical approaches. And so I'm very excited, as I am, you know, uncomfortable often with the work that we must do and that we are doing at BRIC. And I find that it's the more that we are uncomfortable with our institutional approach, is the better it is, and the more connected we are with our artists, with our cultural community, and it goes beyond the transactional, right? And organizations are so transactional. You know, we just our approach for showing work, for applying for funding, for our structures, we're so transactional. And so this is what you have allowed me to think about very much through the framing of friendship, which I never really thought about it that way until Stephen brought this you know, opportunity to me. And I do believe that BRIC over the years has been an organization that has created friendships within the community. But now I'm taking that so much more deeply into our infrastructure, that it's not just a facade, it's not just a programmatic approach, it's about how we see ourselves within, how we are creating spaces for that to exist internally with the staff. You know, in Jamaica, we say, you have to learn for dance yard before you dance abroad. And that's really about doing it at home first before you can go preach to the masses. And so while BRIC has done extraordinary, meaningful work for over 40 years, I'm very much interested in ensuring that internally, that we are having those, you know, that we're reflecting on our own spaces, on our own power dynamics, on the opportunities for us to connect more deeply, to be more authentic, to have generative conflict. And that essentially, to me, feels very much like we're just trying to become friends. So I will leave it there and hand it back over to you, Stephen, for a discussion.
Kristina, thank you. Well, a lot has been condensed in 25 minutes of presentations, but I'd like to begin maybe, Kristina, from the end by talking about, you know, I spoke at the beginning about the personal and political as friendship, and Céline, you also were talking about working with institutions. Shuddha, you were a bit as well. And vulnerability is obviously part of what you're all talking about. And there's that sense, for example, of a kind of oddly personal institutionalism, which you are talking about. It's about changing that structure. You, Céline, talked about exclusionary realities and working with institutions which are places of exclusion. And so all of these ideas seem to orbit around ideas of, well, how do we make these relationships with one another that fit a broad idea of the political? That kind of communitarianism is complicated, it's difficult, it's a challenge. Speaking again, Kristina, of what you said, the idea for nonprofits, at least in the United States, to come to some kind of actual authenticity in which these relationships can take place as a communal political form of friendship is quite interesting. So let me just open it up that way to anyone's comments on the panel.
Well, I'll say that I've found that sometimes there is a lack of curiosity that about the work and the people that we say we're serving and the place that we live in and the people that we come into contact with. And so at BRIC, I talk a lot about kind of, rigorous curiosity. I remember when I was running arts and culture for the state of Connecticut, and I was in the economic development department, there was all of this work around creative economy and what the model and the formula should look like for creative economy work or economic and community development work. And Hartford, as the capital of Connecticut, has such a rich, diverse community. And it was extraordinary that no one started with a question about how other people from other countries come into the space with their own experiences. Like, what is creative economy? Simply, just like, what does it look like for you where you are from? There is an over-privileging of experience sometimes in this country it's noted by me, right? Like, no one has asked me ever in my over 10 years of living in the United States what arts and culture is like in Jamaica. Like, there's never that curiosity, like, tell me more about your community. So there's this, I think there's this lack of true just curiosity within the world that we exist in, the wash, rinse, repeat, that makes it harder to build those connections out the gate that, so that came to mind for me, and I just thought I'd offer that to the conversation.
I mean, Shuddha, when you said the memorable thing about friendship begins with a grounds of estrangement, that seems that it relates in some sense to this, that in that notion of creating a kind of union, a kind of, whether it's emotional, intellectual friendship, or it becomes a civic friendship, seems core to this. You had said to me when we spoke in preparation about what's happening right now in India, about these new laws. How do you think about this?
Well, I was just thinking about it while this conversation took the turn towards curiosity, because I really think curiosity and inquisitiveness and just a certain desire to know about what you don't know is very crucial to what I think of as the forward-looking nature of friendship. Friendship is not necessarily only about the past, because we all know about nostalgia being a glue for friendship, people sharing the times that they grew up together and so on. But for me, crucially, it's also about accepting what you don't know about other people, what will surprise you. And this is, in my understanding, quite related to a kind of way in which one orders politics and civic life in society. Are you prepared as a society to accept people you don't know, or people who come to you as strangers? Is your society and is your sense of community robust enough to be able to deal with the presence of what the Bible calls the widow, the orphan, and the stranger in your midst, right? And the stranger, for me, is absolutely crucial. Over the past 2 years in India, there's been a whole incredible agitation and incredible turbulence to do with different ideas of how we construct citizenship. The regime that rules us today has brought in a law that will make it possible for people from neighboring countries to be citizens of India if they are not Muslim, which means that for those citizens of India who are Muslim, and remember, India is the largest or the second largest Muslim country in the world, suddenly their being Muslim is now a qualifier to their idea of citizenship, which means that before you accept someone, you have to ask, what confession do they declare for themselves? And I think that the great turbulence in our country right now is about saying, do we freeze citizenship to a date in the past where we know each other? Or do we open citizenship to the horizon of the future, where anyone who comes for refuge in our country can be our citizen? And this is the great conflict that is the engine of politics today in our country. So exactly a year ago, the parliament in India passed the citizenship law, which sort of created a tacit idea of citizenship for certain kinds of people. Today, we are in the midst of these protests by farmers who have come to the city. And yesterday, they all held up signs to do with the people who were arrested because of their participation in the citizenship protests. Today's media commentary is asking the question, are these even the friends of farmers? What does this one issue of citizenship have to do with land laws and agricultural reform? And the farmers are actually producing that question, saying, we are prepared to consider a relationship of friendship with people who are not like us. And I think that's very, very crucial. It's at the heart, it's where ethics, aesthetics, and politics intersect. How do you deal with the presence of the surprising, the unfamiliar? Are you always prepared to be open, or do you take a de facto hostile position? And I think that's very crucial to the discussion that we're having.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of similarity, of like to like, shifting, at least in political aspiration, to like to unlike, to what Donna Haraway calls wilder kin, is interesting. And I want to, open the conversation to others, but I would like, Céline, you to introduce the conversation with the audience by saying that when you talk about elective affinities, it seems to me that when you talk about that, and we talk about this kind of strange place that, or conjunction that Shuddha's talking about, elective affinities takes on a very different meaning than it originally did, I think, which was, of course, a German idealist idea, which was therefore all about just a certain kind of person of a certain rank, color, etc. Those were the elective affinities possible. So when we think about this, how do you think about it as being the Ms. support structures as a way to get to the questions? Laurie, for example, in comments wrote about, well, love is the resonance, love is the value, which is a very broad, obviously broad framework of friendship. But how can we lead into those questions through support structures?
Yeah, I mean, they are really interesting, important, and also really, really difficult questions, especially at the moment. And it is incredibly wonderful is the best word I can find to hear Shuddha talk about the farmers in India protesting with a certain sense of availability that one would be, honestly, it would be easy to assume that that kind of availability could only come with privilege, being available to the other within the unknown, right? Mm-hmm. I think it would be really easy to assume, and I have probably assumed that is a position that comes from privilege. I mean, why am I saying this is that, all of this conversation, so from the place where I'm standing, this conversation is arriving, a couple of weeks before Britain leaves the European Union. finally, I mean, I'm not British. I have lived in Britain for a very long time. I'm originally Italian. As you all know, both, I'm French Italian actually, both France and Italy have been undergoing this, you know, extreme readjustment of what they mean by democracy and basing it in an incredibly exclusive set of terms, which mean that it's never been as difficult as it is now to be welcomed anywhere, even if you're a European citizen, right? Which is the most privileged of all, you know, passports. And it is of great sadness to me, I have to say, to on the one hand be talking about inclusion and continue working, you know, in a sort of slightly desperate way, but also continue working in a proactive way. In the terms of inclusion within the grounds upon which I can actually work and exist and continue working and existing, when one is surrounded by something that seems to be going in exactly the opposite direction. It doesn't matter whether it's education or culture. So, you know, there's something about me that tries to keep that depression at bay, because it is extremely depressive, right? And what's depression is the gap between expectation and reality. You know, the expectation that inclusion grows and the reality of all of those micro identities actually making it shrink further and further and further away. So, okay, so that's my, you know, like very instinctive, intuitive reaction to this. However, you know, if I start from my own really like directly, you know, grounded experience, I think that availability, that I think, you know, is my way of translating Shuddha's, you know, the comment, is something that is actually possible to continue demanding of oneself and of others when you enter a conversation, be it within an institutional context or a context, you know, outside, like in the street, meaning a certain requirement, right, of openness to the other, that being the one who is not like yourself. You know, again, this is back to the rejection on the idea of sisterhood. You know, I don't want to share blood with somebody in order to welcome them, right? That is the point. In fact, I want no blood in common, because otherwise it is only sameness and a continuous mirror. And, you know, on that, I really also partake in that idea of friendships with those who might not be there because they died 600 years ago, or because you've never met them, or because you know, maybe because they don't exist even. Let's say, you know, the ideal friend could also have a place in there.
Yeah.
And to have that possibility as a, you know, like in the back of your mind, as a way to continue walking.
Great. I mean, I think we should open it up if anyone has questions. I know that I had mentioned Lori. Lori said that she had raised her hand. Lori, do you want to ask something?
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. I wanted to make a couple comments and ask a couple questions. I felt that the title of this session should be The Politics of Authentic, Harmonious Relationships. One question I have is, how do you differentiate friendship from colleagues? It seems like there's a component of intimacy that's missing when you distinguish institutional relationships and collegiality with the intimacy of friendship. And then does a lack of intimacy inhibit authentic friendships? And is that important to you? And then I wanted to make a comment on my word love, which was not meant in a general sense in terms of friendships, but a very specific thing. I read once in like a 3-minute book at the airport that mature love is distinguished by acts of devotion, which is active. So people feel love which is a goodness in themselves, like a feeling in their heart that they feel loving, but a person who exhibits acts of devotion, actions in love, has a mature love. And so the intergenerational friendships that I have are based on those actions. And then there's a certain reciprocity over time that validate each other and elevate the friendship. And then the final thing I want to say in context to this is that to that regard of devotion and action and the act of mature love being important in life, that I had the opportunity through my husband at the time was in the military, and after deployment, he brought a friend home to stay. So it turned out the friend was a white supremacist, and I come from a Holocaust family. So in the 6 months that he lived here, I cooked for him, I provided a home for him to live in, and I shared who I am, my story, and I created the authentic expression of who I am and my family in hopes that sharing like a safe haven for somebody that has hostility and fear and anger at heart and anti-Semitism, that they would get an opportunity to see that there's no fear or conspiracy in a Jewish person and what a Jewish person might look like. And I don't know if I'm really a Jewish person or not, but just to say that French, and I find over the years that I come across people who are very hateful and hostile, and I make the attempt just to be my authentic self, and hopefully that's enough to establish friendships, or at least lower the temperature and go along in harmony.
Mm-hmm. Anyone want to respond?
If I may.
Yeah.
Stephen. Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit upon a very interesting point. The difference between friendship and collegiality, as far as I'm concerned, is that colleagues don't have to change. You can continue working together in any situation and be who you are. But I think with friendship, there's always a risk that you transform yourself, or that the other person is transformed by being in contact with you. And that preparedness, that preparation to actually become somebody different from whom you were before you met the friend, I think, is one of the things that really distinguishes friendship for me. And it's also a relationship to great works of art. Great works of art can surprise you and can change you. They can also confirm everything about who you are. But we have all had that experience of reading the novel, or looking at the film, or considering a work of dance that you know, there's a before and after the encounter with that. And I think that is something similar to the before and after the encounter with people who are friends. And that is, for me, a very, very important thing, because right now in India, for instance, there is an attempt to force down a set of laws in different provinces that make it difficult for people to convert their religions when they fall in love with each other if they intend to marry. Now, this stems from the great anxiety of the majority of the population of losing some very few people, because most people in India don't marry other kinds of people. Like in most parts of the world, the number of people who actually have interfaith, interrace, intercaste marriages are very few. But those very few instances contain an even fewer set of instances where people actually change. They say, I was this before I met this man or woman or person I fell in love with, and now I have become somebody else. So this great fear of the transformation of the self is the fear that society has for the radical nature of friendship. And I think that's something for us to be, and it's also the reason why conservative establishments fear art, because that can change people.
Céline, you're smiling. Do you have something?
Yes, because I love the proposal that the fear of the other is effectively the fear of extinction, because that's what you're suggesting, right? The disappearance of those like you.
And that fear of the extinction comes usually from hugely majoritarian populations will never go extinct.
Yeah, no, for sure. That is for sure.
I mean, one thing, though, that I would say in response to it is that the work of art, when you talk about that relationship and how with friendship between people, yes, you do become a second person in a sense. It is different because I think what you're proposing is a kind of poetic notion of the artwork, such that there could be true mutuality and reciprocity, when of course that notion of the liveliness, so to speak, or liveness of the object is not the same as the other person exactly. But it's an interesting notion, and that notion of objecthood makes me think about what Kristina had said in terms of the institution as friend, because the institution, of course, is also a mechanical object in a way, a mechanical object filled with people and maybe with human intention, and yet we do think about the institution as a different kind of otherness.
Yeah, something to say about this. I think the idea of reciprocity is also, maybe something that needs to be discussed or opened up. The museum, we know, for example, what the Friends of the Museum or the Friendship of Nations actually, designates. Again, to get away from this romantic idea of, the friendship like a marriage, in effect, that demands the same things from whoever is involved in it. I think, so again, perhaps this is something that is very alienating to people, but I do think I can be a friend of Hannah Arendt. I do not demand reciprocity. I'm not completely insane. However, I do think you can befriend issues or writing or books and carry them with you, carry them towards the future, also distribute them, keeping them alive by talking about them, by teaching with them, by thinking with them in a way that is most like what I would call friendship. I don't think any other word, I can't say I love Hannah Arendt, like that would not be really appropriate. So I think that, and it also, I was reminded of, the experience of artworks when you really have relationships with artworks that are not your own, especially, obviously, because that's completely different. I think when you see your own artworks that you haven't seen for a long time, it's more like seeing old family members. They're like, did you really choose them?
Yeah.
No. But when you go to a museum and see something, or when you have the luck of going to see an exhibition, to see something specific that you like, that you want to see, it is like seeing an old friend. And of course, you don't have demands upon that object, except to just, in a way, be the receiving end of whatever that gaze demands or is looking for. There's that wonderful book called Old Masters by an Austrian writer that I can't remember the name of now, which is entirely set in front of a Velázquez painting, right? The thinking process that is so incredibly productive. That's a productive friendship. But of course, it doesn't demand reciprocity.
Sure. There are a couple of questions. So Clifford Lowe. Clifford, do you want to come on and just speak?
Yeah, my question surrounds, I guess, our present state of shared vulnerability, and I'm wondering if, our sort of social contract to one another, right, can be renewed with this shared notion of a common vulnerability, whether it is to a virus, to economic situations that sort of tie all of us together in some shape or form. So I think both Céline and Shuddha spoke about identifying something in common that we share, and I'm just wondering how you guys are thinking about that.
Yeah, good question. Do you know, the question of vulnerability, I think, is absolutely crucial, really difficult. I'm really no expert. However, I think I would prefer to identify not the thing we have in common, but the thing that there is to do together. You know, so I would prefer action over belonging, if I can choose, right? As a position. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Kristina, I wonder if you might weigh in, because of course we talk about vulnerable communities and the relationship of the institution to reach out to vulnerable communities. And there is, at this moment, because of the pandemic, the economic crises that institutions are in. So they too are vulnerable. How would you think about those relationships?
I think, yeah, vulnerability is key. It has been for me, this being able to be okay with being raw and open, that allows others, in my experience, to do the same. And then there becomes a deeper understanding. Whether or not there's agreement, there's a deeper understanding. And I think back to the first comment around intimacy, and how do you differentiate between friendship and collegiality, and this idea of intimacy. And I think about, as an institution, that intimacy being like closeness and affinity and togetherness is so important. And we spend most of our lives are spent with people that we don't like, that we don't go to sleep with at night, right? Like, we don't go home, and traditionally, most of us, right? We spend most of our hours in whatever jobs we're doing in other places with other people and other communities. And I think intimacy is such an important part of any strong institution. That's just been in my brain, so I bring it up now. But I think vulnerability is key. And I think that we all so much, especially in the arts and cultural nonprofit, want to show face and have a facade that is what we want others to perceive us as, which makes it impossible for us to live our truth, which makes it impossible for artists to come in our spaces and feel like they can live their truth. So to me, it's a fundamental ingredient for the bonds that we're trying to build, at least in our community.
Great. Clifford, does that answer your question to a degree?
Yes.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, so let's end with since we're a little bit over time, with a question from Bella to do with a notion of Donna Haraway's. Bella, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just read what I wrote. Yeah, I'm curious if any of you have given thought to Donna Haraway's ideas on the importance of building meaningful relationships or kinships across species. Do you think any of these ideas you've been talking about can be thought about in the context of learning to live generatively with other critters? And what do you think that kind of friendship / reciprocity looks like? And thank you for all your thoughts so far, guys. This has been awesome.
Shuddha, maybe you should talk about that cup again.
I'm going to talk about my other favorite Greek guy. That's Diogenes, and that's Diogenes' dog, and that's the dog's Diogenes. So much so that, Diogenes and the people, his friends, were called cynics because it was said that they were like dogs, dogs. So the reason why I bring this up is because I think that in some senses, it is easier to talk about friendships across species than it is to talk about friendships within species. We all accept the unconditional solidarities that dogs, cats, human beings, horses, dolphins have. It's not so easy to talk about friendships with cockroaches, and it's not so easy to talk about friendships with the person down the hall who plays loud music at the wrong time of the night. So friendships across species are, I think, really interesting because they change us fundamentally. Human beings have been changed by their intimacy with horses, dogs, and cats. We've become a different kind of species, and so have they. Dogs, horses, and cats, and wheat, for instance, is a life form that has changed because of its contact with us. But I think we have, and this takes a very, very long time, but I think we have to be equally prepared to be changed by the people who rub up against us all the time, whose company we really don't want. I mean, I've known so many people who are more willing to spend time with their dogs than they're willing to spend time with human beings for very good reasons. But that means that it's actually more difficult to be friends with humans. So I would like to take the lessons of interspecies friendship and to translate that into intraspecies friendship, if possible, to accept the radical strangeness of other people.
Other comments? Céline, Kristina? No?
No, my answer was just yes.
Ah.
Interspecies.
Okay. All right. So let me end this conversation here. Thank you so much. It's been great to really begin a conversation. There's so much to think about here. I should add, by the way, that in fact, this summer, Mick Wilson, who's an artist and theorist at the University of Gothenburg and at the Vallond Academy at the University of Gothenburg, and we are going to hold a 2-week intensive between the two schools, which is called "Oh, My Friends, There Is No Friend," which is a quote from Aristotle, on the politics of friendship, where we are going to be thinking for 2 weeks about these subjects. So that's something, I guess if you go to the SVA website and look at continuing education, you would find that course for this summer from July 5th to the 16th. And with that, Kristina, Céline, Shuddha, thank you so much. Thanks to the audience. And we'll end there.